All right. Welcome to the Dealan-de podcast. I'm Adam Dealan-de. I'm here with Zoltan Grossman, and professor at Evergreen State College, member of the Geography and Geography and Native Studies, and you're a longtime community organizer. And I thought we'd just jump in and talk about some various topics. We just before we came on the podcast, we were talking about unlikely alliances, and that's kind of an area you're interested in. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? About written a book about it.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on, and it's great to be able to talk with someone in Olympia about Olympia, and for that matter, about the rest of the world. Yeah. So I've taught geography and native studies at Evergreen since 2005, but a lot of my education has really been more in grassroots community organizing, and particularly in the Midwest and Wisconsin, South Dakota, other places. And I've really found, that there are divisions in American society that a lot of people have been talking about lately, but have really existed for a long, long time. And so some of my work has been around Native American treaty rights, such as fishing rights, which has been contentious in places like Washington back during the fish wars, and in Wisconsin. That was more in the 1980s. And that kind of the assertion of treaty rights by the tribes, the Ojibwe in Wisconsin, Coast Salish, and others around the Pacific Northwest, led to divisions with the white sport fishing, commercial fishing industries. And there was quite a bit of, I would say, racial turmoil that we saw in northern Wisconsin, very similar to what happened here in the 60s and 70s, but this was more in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was very much involved in trying to educate people that the exercise of treaty rights was, under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. Treaties are part of the supreme law of the land, that the tribes were not destroying the fishery by harvesting fish, but in fact their treaty rights could, in a sense, be used to protect the fishery and protect fish habitat. But there was a lot of racial turmoil. There were large crowds of white sport fishers out at night. This was spearfishing at night, and there were attacks on native families, on native fishers. There were, beer cans thrown and slingshots and pipe bombs and sniper fire. And it looked kind of hopeless, that those two communities, it's a lot of what you hear about these days about polarization, especially in rural areas. And so it looked like it was a real uphill struggle. And it was very tough on the native families, on the fishers themselves. It was tough because it divided people even more than they had been divided. But what was really interesting that I found out of that process is that there were the kind of the gung-ho hardcore racist types who were kind of at the forefront of that movement, but then there were also a lot of followers who kind of believed the propaganda that native people were going to destroy the fishery, destroy the local tourism economy. But what started to happen is, perhaps because the two communities were divided, mining companies, metallic mining companies, some of the biggest mining companies in the world, started to come into this area, which has really clean water and a lot of fish. And you started to see a process whereby some of the sport fishers who had been following these racist anti-Indian groups started to realize that, hey, maybe the fish, maybe it's these mining companies. And not only that, but maybe we're stronger in trying to protect the fish from acidic pollution, from cyanide, from all of the negative implications of metallic mining, maybe we're better off joining forces with the tribes because they have treaty rights. They have standing in federal court in order to protect these fish, in order to protect the local tourism economy that we care so much about. And so, over the space of a few years, you had some of the white sport fishers, some of the so-called rednecks, coming over to the side of the tribes and trying to stop these mines, not only because they threaten the fish, but also wild rice is a really important indigenous resource up there. Um, uh, there are other aspects of kind of just the rural lifestyle that's really disrupted when you have huge numbers of miners coming in. And so you started to see this convergence of people who had been um, adversaries or even enemies in previous years. And so I was just fascinated by this, seeing some of these people come around, work together, and they ended up defeating some of the world's largest mining companies: Exxon, Rio Algam, BHP Billiton. And so just watching this happen was really hopeful, um, that there could be ways that the tribes could both fight for their rights, but also have bridges built to some of the local non-native people, that the two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think part of that is my upbringing and my family, where I was taught to value both difference and unity from my parents. I could go into that, but I was just so fascinated. And then to find out that this is happening elsewhere in the country. I'd seen it in South Dakota, where you had cowboys and Indians, literally, who had always been at loggerheads over land, over water rights, over practically everything. And yet, when you have fossil fuel companies coming in, mining companies, sometimes it's the military wanting to do a bombing range or flight testing range that would disrupt both cattle ranching and native ceremonies, and desecrate sacred burial sites or areas where there's petroglyphs. You have also in these really unlikely places like South Dakota, you have the cowboys and Indians coming together. And they actually formed a few groups called the Cowboy and Indian Alliance to fend off oil pipelines and coal trains and bombing ranges. And so I think it's kind of not talked about, especially in discussing rural areas, that there's some hope when neighbors find some common ground and yet also respect each other's differences. You can have some amazing turnaround. So I've called this phenomenon unlikely alliances. It's also very, very much the case in recent years in Washington and Oregon, when you have the coal trains and oil terminals and proposed in places like Grays Harbor County, which was also very divided by fish wars, also by the spotted owl wars. And you have labor against environmentalists and tribes against environmentalists. And yet when it came to the oil industry wanting to have three um, uh, oil terminals in Hoquiam and a bunch of exploding oil trains coming through the Northwest, you had even some pretty conservative folks that realized that this is not going to be good for our local economy, and joining with the Quinault Nation in this case to stop, to successfully stop these projects against pretty much overwhelming odds. Everyone thought it was a done deal, but because those communities came together, it really frightened the global oil industry. And so I find this, um, you know, some hope, even in the worst of polarized political times, or even the worst times of seeing climate change come in. I think that there are ways that people can come together and affect change. That's unlikely alliances.
Yeah, and I think we are facing um, a lot of need for unlikely alliances with globally or what's happening from what comes up for me is when you're talking is the idea of place, like who takes ownership for place. Um, it makes sense, Native communities, First Nations people, they take an ownership for their land, their place. They have treaties, but then there's the settlers and people who have moved here that um, start to take ownership for place as well, for where they live, and that alliance can be where that unlikely alliance is the commonality is the the need to the mutual desire to see the place you live
Yeah.
sustain.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And they may love the place together. They may love it in very different ways.
Mhm.
Having a presence in a place for centuries or even thousands of years is a different kind of attachment to place than your family perhaps having arrived, 5 decades ago or 8 decades ago or even 100 years ago. It's a different kind of love of place, and yet you can find those two, um, those two attachments to place coming together in terms of defending it from outsiders, defending
Mhm.
it from an outside threat, and accepting that the other who perhaps you were excluding, um, that I think, some of the chants that I heard by some of the white sport fishers against some of the tribal members, white man's land or Indians go home, which was always my favorite because Indians go home. Um, but they just saw Native people in their place on the reservation, right? And so, to kind of expand that idea of home, that's what a lot of them talked about. What is home? And for white people, for European Americans, are you, is your attachment to some other place, to some other continent, to where your ethnic groups comes from? In my case, it's Hungary. Or do you see North America as home? And if you see it as home, you know, are you going to treat it as home? Um, and so I think some of what's going on in Washington and Oregon, especially in Washington, because of the co-management of natural resources between the tribes and the state, you have this process of people coming together not only to keep out bad stuff, but also to repair the damage that's already been done, and using treaty rights as legal leverage to do that. Treaty rights, not just saying the tribes have a share to the fish, but that the tribal rights have standing in federal court in order to protect the fishery. And so you have tribes here like the Nisqually, who are recognized as the lead entity in their watershed to set plans for salmon habitat restoration, to basically heal the harms, to reverse some of the damage done by settler colonialism, to the benefit of everyone, to the benefit of the farmers that are farming in the Nisqually Valley, to the benefit of seeing the estuary going back from its kind of colonized state of becoming diked pasture land, taking out those dikes and letting the tidal waters flow in and out freely, um, to remove the dams on the Elwha River and other rivers in the Pacific Northwest. So those barriers aren't there anymore. So some of the student research projects we do at Evergreen are to kind of study this slow reversal, this healing of the landscape through decolonization. That's also to the benefit, not just of the tribes, but of everybody. And so to be able to kind of witness this, front row seat here in Olympia, to some of these amazing things that are happening, both to prevent further harms and in reversing the harms that already exist, and having the tribes, be leadership in that, not simply be left out like they usually are, or to not have their voices respected. Now their voices and their powers are being respected to a greater extent, at least, than in other states. And you can see in some places the salmon coming back, maybe the beaver coming back, maybe, some of these watersheds are going to be able to function better than they would have if it wasn't for treaty rights. So, how this kind of thing that's kind of seen as, oh, this is just the rights of this minority racial group. It doesn't have anything to do with me. But when you look at it in terms of place and in terms of a tool to be able to defend that place, treaty rights and tribal sovereignty are extremely important. And that's one reason we've had better success in Washington than in Oregon and Northern California, places that they're really beginning to see salmon completely disappear.
And it seems like, like the harbor of Tacoma, they're doing we're doing a lot of restoration, and I think there's an idea of like we've kind of what's the term? It's like we've kind of overcome our uh, economic imperialism, or however you want to call it. It's like we're now healing the work, but it seems as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, we just export it? Like we exported all these industries to China, to overseas, to other countries. They still exist, but now they're over there, and we've been getting the products from that. But our land here is now in a process of healing, but yet what's happening over there, we don't know.
Yeah, and I think and looking at the mining industry, some of the really horrific like gold cyanide mines that you see in places like um, Central America or Peru or Indonesia, the exporting of that um, of those burdens, it's definitely part of that same kind of imperial system. And yeah, the cheap labor, exploiting cheap labor abroad. And one of the classes that I am currently teaching, Taking Back Empire, also some of the classes like American Frontiers, really makes the connection between the so-called Indian Wars here in North America and some of the wars that happened in other countries. That really the idea of manifest destiny, or the idea that European colonialism is justified in taking over other people's land, that it kept going when it reached here in the Pacific coast, and you saw the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. You saw the Philippine American War of liberating the Filipinos from the Spanish, only to turn the Philippines into a colony. You saw the Vietnam War, and in all those wars they used terminology, um, basically that this is Indian country, and kind of transported that idea of native peoples as the enemy, as the insurgents, to these other places, and up to the present day wars in the drone wars in places like Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, where a lot of them are in what is called tribal regions that still have retain some sense of tribal identity, and are kind of, whatever their practices are, they've been kind of out of reach of global corporations, of corporate rule. And so whatever their ideologies, there's this effort to kind of militarize the situation all over again. And so to really see a tie in between what happened at home and what's happening at home, and our own US history, even our local history, and what happens in other countries, especially other settler colonial countries, um, is one thing that I try to do a lot at Evergreen. That we're not just talking about, domestic policy, but also foreign policy, and how the two actually are very much tied together. And so in a way, foreign policy is, you know, um, Indian policy exported, and you can see those same kind of exploitation of land, exploitation of labor, and if people are in the way, um, that's tough for them. And so, to understand what's happening at home and what's happening abroad is part of the same picture, and not just feeling like, oh, we don't have to deal with that, because it always comes home. Um, Anything we do abroad comes home into the United States, just as what we do in the United States ends up happening in other countries.
Talking a little about the history and the history of place, and most people don't even know. I mean, what happened here? I know that there's potentially some skirmishes, maybe you call it a war in this area. how would you describe it? What took place in this region? Talking about Olympia, Thurston
Mhm.
County.
Well, I've been thinking and studying it a lot lately because our last two classes, American Frontiers and Taking Back Empire, have been involved in um, developing self-guided walking tours of downtown Olympia on the Story Maps app of ArcGIS. So basically, you can access it on any phone if you look up Olympia's hidden histories, and so learning about you could live in Olympia your entire life. I've only lived here 18 years, and I didn't know a lot of this stuff, but to understand that the one of the bands or several of the bands that make up the Squaxin Island tribe today, um, each of those bands was identified with a particular inlet of the South Sound, and there were villages at what's today is Tumwater Falls. There was a village just downtown around the Olympia Center, Mekong Restaurant, that area around Capitol and State, um, called Buschutwood, which is where a place of the Black Bear, and so there were a number of longhouses on the seven inlets of the South Sound that now make up the Squaxin Island tribe. And when Governor Isaac Stevens, the territorial or colonial governor, who wanted the tribes to sign away their land in order to make way for the railroads for settlers, many of the settlers that were already here got along pretty well with the tribes, um, and were working with them on trading relationships. But Stevens wanted to bring in many thousands more and wanted to industrialize the area, sometimes meeting opposition from some of the settlers themselves, who sometimes had alliances with the tribes. But the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which was December of 1854, was signed in the Nisqually Delta area, kind of around where exit 114 is today. For many years, even when I first moved here, there was a big snag, a dead tree that was standing there that had been there at the time of the treaty signing. So it really wasn't, in a sense, that long ago. It was basically the lifetimes of two 85-year-olds ago. So there might be an 85-year-old in Olympia today that when they were a baby, they were on the knee of another 85-year-old who was alive at the time of the treaties. And so that was really the attempt to isolate the tribal nations inside very small reservations. And when a couple of them, in particular Nisqually, um, Puyallup, felt that they didn't get enough land to be able to survive on, they fought after the treaty. It was called the Puget Sound Indian War, 1855, 1856. There were massacres of men, women, and children, atrocities, human rights atrocities against the tribes. And the assassination in Olympia of one of the leaders, and the execution in Steilacoom of Leschi, another one of the leaders. So the kind of warfare that you associate with other countries was very much, going on right here. And so at that time, the village that was downtown, Buschutwood, was forcibly removed and was moved to Squaxin Island. All the different bands were moved to Squaxin Island, which had no fresh water. They weren't allowed to go off the island in order to fish. So it was almost like a concentration camp. And so you had that kind of process. If it was in other countries like former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, we call it ethnic cleansing. Well, it happened right here in Olympia, that kind of displacement. And so you had a wall, a separation wall built along 4th Avenue, a log stockade wall, to keep out, during the war, to keep out tribal members from coming into the downtown area. And it was basically a land grab. This is a very, very lucrative area for shellfish. Both the Squaxin people and Chinese had harvested shellfish right down in the Deschutes River estuary. And of course, timber being the most lucrative product of the area. And so you kind of had what drew people to Olympia was the Olympia oyster, but all the pollution from the timber industry and invasive species coming in kind of destroyed that oyster. There's efforts to bring it back at this point. And then you also had other communities, working class communities. You had a shantytown community built along the east bank of the Deschutes estuary called Little Hollywood, which was multiracial. It was native float houses. It was immigrant community, Black community, white working class community. And it was kind of seen as the Badlands, as health hazard, fire hazard, much like the Chinatown had been treated as a blight on the community, so it has to be moved around. So this history of kind of displacement of people in downtown Olympia, be they indigenous, be they Chinese immigrants, be they working class people. In that case, that community called Little Hollywood was razed to the ground in the 40s to make way for the Fifth Avenue Dam, which was constructed in 1951. So that community was displaced, was torn down in order to build Capitol Lake, which was a pond to reflect the state capitol. And so for decades now, there's been a movement, one of these unlikely alliances that's brought together the Squaxin Island tribe, Nisqually tribe, environmentalists, the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team, quite a few people interested in the health of the shellfish and the fishery of Butt Inlet, of the Salish Sea. And finally, last October, the State Department of Enterprise Services issued their final EIS and said that dam's going to come out. So that's part of that healing of the estuary systems that you see with the removal of the Elwha dams, the removal of the dikes in the Nisqually Delta. Now we're going to be able to see that whole process take place right here in Little Olympia with the replacement of Capitol Lake, which has become a toxic soup of, toxic algae and invasive species. You can't even let your dog swim in Capitol Lake. And that's going to be drained and replaced by more natural tidal flows, and to try not to return it to its natural state as it was before settler colonialism, but to definitely have it be a healthier place. And so that's going to be a really interesting project over probably the next 10 years to be able to see that happening. And then you see the Squaxin Island tribe that had been forcibly removed, displaced from downtown Olympia. Increasingly, you see these beautiful murals painted by Joe Seymour, the four salmon upon the Views on Fifth building, also by Joe Seymour. You see the tribal canoe journeys having come in twice to Swantown. You see tribal investments downtown, co-sponsoring of festivals. You see Priest Point Park changing to Squaxin Park, and kind of the presence of that tribe coming back into the place where they had been removed from. And that's it's more of a cultural healing, a political healing, a economic healing of realizing, hey, there are, I've been contributing to the Squaxin economy every time I, what is it? Triple Dragon Fortune Unleashed. Every time I put some money in those slots, I'm in a sense paying reparations to the Squaxin Island tribe, and that revenue that's come into the tribe has enabled them to be business leaders in the South Sound area. And so all that kind of comes together, the cultural, the political, the environmental, that's witnessing a reversal of what happened in the 19th century in the 21st century. It's not dramatic, it's not enough, it's not happening quickly enough, but it is amazing to see it finally after all these years.
Yeah, the history is it's. I wish we had more ways to highlight that. I appreciate you sharing the stories of the history of this area. Um, and then what we said, like you said, the it's almost like the frontier line is has transitioned out through the Pacific, out to through to China, and now it's a kind of a global line um, that we're facing, and so we're all like still supported within here, kind of within an empire now. We're within the empire as opposed to on the border of the empire. Um, and how does that look? Do you see? We're almost in a global. Well, we are in a global situation.
Yeah,
With
and
the network. Go ahead.
I think one place where a couple of places you can see that in downtown Olympia, right next to where the Squaxin Village was, is the Olympia Rafa Solidarity mural. That really a lot of people see it. It's this giant wall, and it has an olive tree with leaves on it, and a big wall, depiction of a wall being washed away by waves, and that's really it's honoring an Evergreen student, Rachel Corey, who was killed in the Gaza Strip in 2003, around the same time the Iraq War started, when she was defending a Palestinian home from an Israeli military bulldozer. And just that idea that of solidarity with other people for whatever reasons, for whatever story is going on in those countries, that you can see the well-being of someone in another country being tied up to your own well-being, and their freedom affects your freedom and vice versa. And so that story and the different community organizations that have these leaf images on the olive tree, some of them Palestinian, some of them Israeli, some of them from Mexico, some of them from Olympia, some of them anti-war groups, some of them military veterans groups, and you see them trying to find some commonalities across these international borders, and that maybe people to people diplomacy can be as powerful as conflicts between countries or within countries. And so that story, of using tragedy to build greater understanding is I think something that should be better known in Olympia. Then you also have the Port of Olympia, which has been, in a sense, and that's what our current class is studying, that the port is really what connects us in Olympia to the rest of the world. And the fact that we have, the logs that are being exported by Weyerhaeuser, um, instead of being milled here at home, and providing timber mill jobs to people in places like Grays Harbor County or Thurston County. They've been exported at first to Japan, and then after China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, exported in very great numbers to China, for their construction industry, for their mills, and also to South Korea. And so you can really see kind of, the spotted owl wars pit labor against environmentalists, but increasingly there's a blue-green alliance of blue-collar people and environmentalists that are saying, hey, why are these raw logs being exported by Weyerhaeuser instead of keeping them at home? So that's kind of the exporting of our economy, of our jobs to other countries. Then you also had, of course, people in Olympia around, and during the Iraq War knows that Olympia, the port of Olympia, was kind of a center of opposition to the shipping of equipment, in this case, Stryker armored vehicles, from what was then Fort Lewis, what's today known as Joint Base Lewis McChord, or JBLM, shipping those strikers to the Iraq War, basically a war for oil, and that because this is a public port, not a corporate-owned port, people in Olympia felt that they should have a say in whether or not this happened. When that didn't happen, there were kind of inevitably protests, blockades. People had different opinions about that, but public opinion definitely turned in the later stages of the war against the war and in favor of bringing the troops home. In fact, the level of opposition to the war within the military was just as high as among civilians. And so that story played out right here in Olympia and was heard, by people around the country, around the world, that Olympia, um, was one of the places that was very much opposed to the continuation of the war. And then you had 10 years later, almost exactly, um, almost the same kind of issue and another oil war, only this one within the boundaries of the United States in North Dakota at the time of the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota people standing up against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. You had ceramic proppants, which are like a fracking sand that props the cracks open to be able to extract the oil in North Dakota, which was number 2 in oil production after Texas in the US. And you had the Port of Olympia, in this case, not sending raw logs to China, but bringing these fracking supplies from China and putting them on trains to ship out to North Dakota, which is really an environmental catastrophe and also a social catastrophe in terms of the disruption to the rural lifestyle, the farming lifestyle, the women feeling endangered by this huge influx of people from outside their area. And so, in the same way, younger people, well, a lot of older people were against the importation of these fracking proppants, partly because oil fracking contributes to climate change, but also because of the violation of the human rights of Native peoples in the Dakotas. And so twice the tracks were blocked downtown to keep those trains from going to North Dakota. And eventually that contract was canceled, like the contract with the Army for the strikers was canceled. And so that whole idea of thinking globally, but acting locally has really been played out in Olympia, which is not, it's not Seattle, it's not Portland, it's not a big city, but there's a tradition here of people saying, we want to make sure that our local institutions are not participating. You also have a unique case here in Olympia, Tacoma, of a very large progressive anti-war community right next to the largest military base on the West Coast, JBLM. And so you can see instances where there's friction and where there are clashes between those two communities, but you also see a lot of instances of dialogue, of cooperation, of finding common ground, another unlikely alliance between people who don't want the troops to go overseas and some of the troops and their families themselves. And we see that in our classroom. We have a lot of veterans going to Evergreen, and we have really rich, interesting conversations about what being deployed means, and how when veterans come back, they don't feel supported in terms of healthcare, in terms of jobs and job training, and just a lot of those issues. We're more aware of those in Olympia, Lacey, Tacoma than, let's say, some of my friends back home in Wisconsin that don't really interact much with the military. And nowhere else in the country do you have most military bases are in really rural areas, quite conservative areas, and you don't have that relationship between those two parts of society in other places.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely have a unique situation with the base here. Um, the big thing is it's like so much of the edge of the empire are so far away. You know, decisions are made the other end of the coast. You know, the effects are in other countries, and we kind of sit in a little bit of a bubble. Uh, you know, relatively economically stable, government jobs, everything's kind of somewhat stable in this region, and we're seeing some progress, like you just laid out with the reclaiming the land, and so it's sort of like we're in this bubble of things are getting maybe better or things are not so bad, while we are kind of benefiting from a global system that is damaging other places in the world. You know, when you're talking about the what happened here
Yeah,
with the local tribes, I can't help but think of places like Syria, where that's kind of like the edge of the empire, are really affecting people there under the
yeah,
same.
yeah. Sorry, I actually lost a lot of what you said because you
Oh,
froze or I froze or somebody.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just saying that we're sort of in this bubble right now, you know, where we're not really, you know, there's no sanctions right here. There's no, you know, we're not the edge of the empire. We're kind of in a bubble within the empire that is doing somewhat okay. You know, there's other areas of the country that are suffering more under the economic realities or the global financial system or whatever, you know. So it's sort of it's and like I was saying, that decisions are being made thousands and thousands of miles away. It's hard to feel empowered to change things, and hard to feel like we're at the edge of the effect of things. But yet, you know, things are happening here. And then I was saying that, you know, in places like Syria, that's where, you know, that's kind of the edge of empire right now. That you're like you're saying, the wars that happened here are now happening in places like Syria, which are being sanctioned and trying to be pushed in
yeah,
line.
yeah. And also, really JBLM being so important because of this. I think the Obama administration called it the pivot to Asia or the pivot to the Pacific. That really the more rivalry there is, in particular with China, but also with North Korea, that JBLM is, situated, you know, and is going to be playing even more of a role.
Mhm.
I hope there isn't a horrific war between the US and China, especially over Taiwan. That could very easily go nuclear, and new Korean War could also go nuclear. And so anything to avoid that from happening
Yeah,
and to try and tone down some of the polarization that's growing on both sides of those two conflicts is really paramount right now. And we can find ourselves very quickly in a situation, whether it's like Vietnam or Iraq. There's the US has come very close to going to outright war in Syria, or bombing Iran. That would also be just a regional conflagration that would make the Iraq war, look like a picnic. And so, what I found interesting under both Obama and Trump, both of them were very heavily pressured, to be more aggressive towards Iran. Both of them actually, at the end of the day, seem to draw the line at direct intervention. And so I think that's because they're just like after the Vietnam War, there was a real reluctance by Americans to get involved militarily in other countries. And you saw that in Central America. Weren't, there were indirect invasions supporting Contras, supporting the Salvador military, but there wasn't a direct invasion. In the same way, after the disasters of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, there's a real reluctance that somehow our military is going to go and fix somebody else's problems in other countries. And so, even though there's not this strong, visible anti war movement, there's still really strong anti war sentiment um, that cuts across ideological boundaries, actually. And I think is pretty healthy. Um, and you could have a situation where, we think we're safely distant from these wars. But if there's a war with China, it's going to affect the Pacific Northwest. It's going to affect Alaska. China's not going to hold back. And so we might think, like the Ukrainians did a year ago, that, we're living pretty well. We feel like we're protected, but war has a way of unsettling capitalism in a sense. It's because it's so unpredictable, and so that's one of the reasons I tend to focus on the history of military interventions, the history of military bases. The more bases we have around the world, the more likely we are to get involved in these wars. And instead of looking to the people of Russia, the people of China, and supporting their democratic movements, the more we militarize the situation, the more those regimes of Putin and Xi are able to say, well, we're under siege from the West, and therefore, if you are protesting against your government, you're helping the West. And so that enables their crackdown. It helps their crackdown to be encircled or under siege by the West. And so I think there are ways to support democracy in those countries rather than to weaken those democratic movements by constantly looking to militarization as the answer. Setting an example of a real democracy that's functioning, that's multi-ethnic, multiracial, that's really the way that the United States can set an example.
Well, we also see, like you said, that crackdown on democracy is also happening with all parties involved in the war, in wars.
Yeah,
We're seeing that in the U.S. The crackdown on freedom of speech, or the increase in surveillance, or how, from the Patriot Act
yeah,
to Ukraine, that they're blocking. There's a lot, heavy censorship there. There's no opposition parties allowed. There's, unions are broken up. So it's like we all war kind of is an enemy to democracy everywhere, so to speak.
yeah. And you see the United States supporting some of the regimes that are the most anti-democratic. This Saudi Arabia that's been bombing the hell out of Yemen. Some of the uh, governments in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Turkey, that have been cracking down on democracy most recently. And being in NATO apparently doesn't mean anymore that you're supposed to be democratic. Kind of never did, because there were other right-wing dictatorships that were part of NATO, like Spain and Portugal and Greece. But the idea that somehow NATO is just about democracy is really not the case. And so setting an example by emphasizing democracy is what can inspire people in places like Ukraine, instead of backing up one dictatorship in order to fight another dictatorship, arming the Saudis in order to counteract the Iranians. That's just an endless cycle of tit for tat violence and tit for tat repression. So, I just was really struck going back to the local scale that, what we were seeing in the port of Olympia, with shipping the strikers to Iraq, was part of an oil war. And then what was, exporting the proppants to North Dakota was part of another oil war. And then all of the possibilities of war with Iran or with China in the South China Sea, so much of that has to do with oil.
Yeah.
And so, kind of the idea that our climate future and what's happening to the climate is very much tied into, what's happening with our global trade, what's happening with militarism in other countries. So you tend to have the wars happening in places where there's oil or other, now it's, lithium, other natural resources. And
Yeah.
that's where you tend to have regimes that are anti-democratic, because If your government like Iran in 1953 wants to nationalize the oil industry, or Chile in 1973 wants to nationalize the copper industry, that's when you get a coup. That's when you get military intervention, was when the people try to take control of those resources. And in some cases, in places like now Colombia, Ecuador, some of the movements want to take control of the resources in order to not drill for oil anymore, um, in order to change their economies towards a green economy, in those countries where they could probably pull it off. And, that's the kind of transformation. You don't think of switching to solar or wind as part of a program to stop wars, but it is.
Mhm.
And it is also isn't a matter of, oh, let's have energy independence and let's pollute the hell out of the United States to make up for not having dependence on foreign sources of oil. That's just bringing the problem home. Why not actually transform the economy towards a clean energy economy, and in that way both reduce dependence on some of these foreign war zones, or dictatorships, and try to heal our own ecosystems and our own inequalities, by switching to other sources of energy, or for that matter other materials, that are more preferable than the wholesale extraction of resources. There are a lot of creative things that are going on out there, and evergreen students are involved in a lot of let's have other methods of agriculture, let's have other methods of building materials, let's really build the economy on some new stuff instead of just doing the old stuff and getting back in these ruts, whether it's of pollution, the explosion of the chemical train in Ohio, um, or whether it's constantly getting involved in wars.
Which kind of brings back to what you originally your book, and it's the unlikely alliances, forming these alliances, which is a tricky thing to think. On one level, finding the commonality, but how does you find your commonality and still hold true to your own values?
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
that's a big issue. Just recently, the anti-war, there's a big rage against the war machine, which is a big anti-war rally, which maybe you're familiar with, that happened in Washington D.C. and then happened in Tacoma. And there was the criticism of that is it was people that were on the left uniting with libertarians, and people that hold maybe anti-LGBTQ um, opinions, and yet should we align with them for an anti-war movement, or when they are not quite in our they're not in our camp, so to speak, standing against our own rights, which I can imagine uh, First Nations people were having that same thing. Wait a minute, should we align with these people when they when they
right.
stand against us and they have racist and uh, opinions towards us? What do you think about that, or how does one do that?
Yeah, whatever issue we're involved in, whatever your ideology, we spend far too much time just talking to the people that we feel are right for the right reasons,
Mhm.
and talking and obsessing about the people who we think are wrong for the wrong reasons. um, and people who probably aren't going to be swayed by our arguments. But there's also, so in terms of the anti-war movement, right for the right reasons would be, you oppose war because of what it does not only to Americans but to people in other countries. And then wrong for the wrong reasons would be the pro-war side. But there's always two other groups of people, and there's one group of people that are, you might see as wrong for the right reasons. For instance, they might think, oh, occupying Afghanistan would be a good thing for the women of Afghanistan, when in fact that doesn't really add up, because the first oppressors of women's rights in Afghanistan, the first government, was actually the one that the US backed even years before that the Taliban came to power 4 years before in '92 when the Mujahideen took power. That was the government that oppressed women's rights. So um, occupying Afghanistan is not the way. In fact, it can create backlash. So I don't agree with the premise, but people with good hearts have said that. Um, and so you can kind of engage with them and talk with them on that level, because in a sense you both might support women's rights. There are also people, and it's a little trickier, who are perhaps right and side with you, but for the wrong reasons. For instance, they might see the Iraq War or uh, oil companies as a Jewish conspiracy, right? Or might think that our environmental problems are caused by immigrants, right? And it is very difficult to build bridges to them, and you can do so tactically. I wouldn't do so strategically. I wouldn't form an alliance with those people. So I would actually disagree with doing that, of legitimizing or normalizing those ideas. But like I said, what happened in Wisconsin, you engage with their followers, who perhaps that's their introduction to, there's a problem with the world. There are wars going on. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. There's inequality, there's environmental catastrophe. I'm not sure why it's happening, but here's someone giving me this explanation. Well, if there were other people there giving different sorts of explanations, then they might be listened to also. So it's not a matter of engaging with the leaders of those groups, but I would engage with the followers. And sometimes that could be seen as like white people's work, right? It's not something I would ask people of color to do.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's important to do that. And I think, in fact, especially rural areas, because it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that progressive people that tend to be in cities don't engage with people in rural areas. That leaves a vacuum for the right wing to fill, to look down on those people, or somehow to have a sense of class superiority, that these are just a bunch of rednecks, they're not worth talking to, it's a political, cultural wasteland out there. um, that seeds the ground to the right wing, who does take those people seriously and is trying to reach them. And so there are groups like in Oregon, the Rural Organizing Project, or in Montana, the Northern Plains Resource Council, that works with farmers and ranchers, and tries to give, not give them, but it's a part of their tradition, to treat the land well, to leave something for the children, to be hospitable to people coming into your community, to have that sense of moral virtue of, let's say they're immigrants fleeing a war zone, to have a sense of charity towards them, to play on kind of the positive values you have in those communities, instead of the fear, the hate, the manipulation that these right-wing groups bring in. And so that can work if it's tried, right? Instead of just retreating into, progressive ghettos in Seattle or Portland or Olympia, to really be supportive of some of the people in places like Aberdeen, Hoquiam, the Tri-Cities, who are doing that really hard work of educating, mobilizing their neighbors around some of these issues. I think they need a lot of support. And a county might have voted 65%, for Trump, but that still leaves 35% who didn't. And we should be supportive of them, and expanding that work, because change. The only thing that's inevitable is change. And it's a question of which direction that change is going to go. So we have places that voted twice for Obama that then ended up voting for Trump. And why is that? And how can that be reversed? And how can we bring out the good in those communities, or support those who are trying? And in many cases, like I mentioned with Quinault and the oil terminals, and in many of these cases, the tribes are at the forefront of talking, engaging with some of their neighbors. that may be of very different values and very different opinions. But they're making headway in many cases. And so I think that that's something that needs to be supported.
Yeah, and I think an example was when I remember when Bernie Sanders went down to Virginia and did a rally, and it was on CNN or whatever. Um, they kind of pressed him on some issues, and he said, very firmly and forthrightly said, "Hey, I am pro-choice, and that's not going to change. I'm not. We don't agree here, but where we can agree is NAFTA, or we can agree with universal health or Medicare for all, or and everybody applauded. So even though the audience was a pro-life audience, didn't agree with him on this issue, that he had, hey, we agree here, and they applauded him. Said, okay, we
Yeah.
agree. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would have voted for him, even though he doesn't, have that same step. So I think that that's kind of where that unlikely alliance. Say, hey, this is let's not. We're not gonna hide or even skirt away from where like this is where we truly stand. But this is where I can agree with you on it. Can we work together
Yeah.
on a certain
Yeah.
issues? I think is a great way to take it on.
And so much of politics is about, talking points and slogans and,
Yeah,
memes and yet when people actually are, you know, hearing other people's stories. I remember the sanctuary movement in the 1980s when Central American refugees were brought in by churches uh to as a haven from the violence, and a lot of the parishioners of those churches heard their stories for the first time. That really affected a sea change in public opinion about the wars in Central America. Hearing these personal stories, I think hearing the stories of women who have been either harassed or forced to have children, and some of the horrific stories that are coming out of places like Texas right now, that's what convinces people that there's something wrong going on. It's not, supporting a particular piece of legislation. It's not about particular politician one way or the other. It's about understanding the very human stories of the suffering that people are going through, that refugees are going through, that women are going through, that LGBTQ people are going through. It's those that, how did gay marriage happen, right? It
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
through some political ideological drive. It's through people having personal familiarity. So I think that that is an important part of it, and highlighting the storytelling, I think, is so important, where you can move people with stories in the way that you can't necessarily with slogans or through social media. And I think that one of the problems with social media is not only that it's, the algorithms have highlighted polarization, but that we've gotten used to organizing movements through a Facebook post instead of through personal engagement, instead of through door to door, old fashioned, not door to door. I wouldn't do that these days so much, but through, face to face instead of Facebook, right? And it's those ways that people can be convinced to change their minds through, learning from their kids who learned about recycling or climate change or Black history at their school. That's, people learn within their circle of friends, within their families. They don't necessarily get it by, watching either Fox or MSNBC or, through attending political rallies necessarily. It's through that slower, less glamorous kind of education and organizing that that people get involved, that people feel like they have a stake in it, that it actually affects their lives.
yeah, and yeah, I agree with you. But I don't know. Maybe door to door is a good idea too.
I just wouldn't do it because of safety, right?
Yeah,
Things that people do have guns, and that's a big part of it.
yeah,
That kind of fear of like, you don't know what's going to happen, and so you avoid doing anything, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's part of we think of militarization being in other countries, and boy, I felt militarization, and you may not even see it, but you're just the fact that it's there and you don't know what's going to happen. That generates fear. This is a very armed society, and so
I
I
think
think
of
that
the Freedom Riders and what they faced doing.
yeah, and what people in other countries, that are facing right now, in whether Yemen or what's going on in Peru or Ukraine, or you know um the the kinds of things that people are going on in other countries. And that's the thing, is that people ask, um you know organizers, activists like myself. And I think there's a difference between organizing and activism. Activism is acting with the people who are already convinced. Organizing is trying to bring new people in. But they often ask us, well, this is really tough. You're doing stuff around climate change, and isn't that depressing? Or you're talking about things in other countries, and or these really negative things happening. And it's like, well, yeah, but what other people are going through is so much harsher. What the native people who were having the rocks thrown at them was way worse than anything I went through, working with them or standing with them. And so I think this idea that somehow we have to protect our kids, or that the main thing is protecting yourself from negative news, I think is almost a privilege. And I don't know. I think putting yourself in someone else's shoes, even temporarily, or at least having enough respect for them to hear their story, is something that we as Americans really have a responsibility to do. Because our country, and ours isn't the only country, the European Union, Russia, China have also caused harm in terms of the global ecosystem, and wars internal or abroad. But we have caused some harm around the world, and so maybe it's our responsibility to at least take a moment and listen to some of the people who have been affected by it, or who are going through rough times around us, and having some, not just empathy, but understanding, it's you today, but it might be me tomorrow. That kind of solidarity, that your freedom, your well-being is tied to my freedom and my well-being. If you're not free, if you're not doing well, that means I'm not either. And that's the kind of solidarity we kind of need in society, instead of, oh, that's too tough to hear, I'm not gonna listen to this anymore. All you're being asked to do is to listen about it, not to actually experience it. And other people have had to experience it, and maybe we could take a little load off of them, right, to take a little bit of that pain away, and take maybe deflect some of the anger away from them and towards ourselves, if they're being attacked. And that way um spreading around a little bit more empathy in society, sharing
Yeah.
some of that pain a little bit.
And there's something that feels good about taking action, even if it feels hopeless. It feels good to take action, even on a small level.
Yeah.
It can feel good to the heart.
Yeah, it feels good to the heart. And also, I've lived long enough now that it was something that seemed hopeless, you know, 10 years ago, suddenly, almost overnight,
Yeah,
looks like it's possible. And
yeah,
so you really have to pay a tribute to the people who, were talking about climate change before it was popular. We're talking about, same-sex marriage,
yeah,
and these kinds of things, and who, faced illegal abortions when they were really illegal before Roe. And
yeah.
listening to some of the stories and learning from them about what might be possible today. And so things do change over time. And if you're part of the change rather than just observing the change, you feel like you were a part of it. And there were 14 oil and coal terminals planned for the coast of the Pacific Northwest 10 years ago, and all 14 have been defeated. That's amazing. And all of those were sold to us as done deals in the early stages. But by coming together, by forming these alliances, people stopped them. And so, now there's coal mines in Montana that have been canceled because they can't export that coal to China through our ports. So, you can affect change, you can do things. And I think our media or educational system is kind of geared towards everything's hopeless, everything's depressing. They report on the bad news. They don't report about people coming together very often. You don't hear about that. Teachers are you can teach about all the negative stuff in American history, but you don't hear much about the coming together of people in American history that brings about successful change. When you do, that's when you're criticized as a teacher. And so, we have to somehow find those stories elsewhere, find those stories in our lives, and find them where they're available. So thanks for doing this podcast to let people give some information that otherwise might be hidden. And I think that's one of the purposes of our students working on these self-guided walking tours called Olympia's Hidden Histories, is to take some of that history that's been hidden all these years and bring it to the surface so people understand the past a little bit better in order that the future can be a little bit better.
I'll put some links in at the bottom of this to that, and I'll also link to your book there that you have.
Okay,
And,
cool.
yeah, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was an enlightening conversation. I enjoyed it. Appreciate. I'm glad I reached out.
Well, thanks, Adam. Really. And I love to try the bagels sometimes.
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely. All right, awesome.
Cool.
All right,
Okay.
well, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
All
Thanks,
right, take
Adam.
care. Bye.
Bye-bye.